The sound of slow, measured footsteps echoed through the streets of London. Black coats, white gloves, the cold glint of polished metals on red uniforms. Everything moved with precision until it didn't. Among the sea of silent mourners and rigid guards, two women stood side by side, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and Princess Anne, the King's sister. For hours, they had remained still, faces composed, eyes heavy with loss. They knew the cameras were watching, the world was watching, but something deeper stirred behind their silence. Then, as the royal coffin turned the corner toward the chapel, a gust of wind disturbed the white rose atop it, a rose laid there hours earlier by young Prince George. It tilted, slipped, almost fell. Catherine's eyes followed it, her breath caught, and noticed. Their shoulders touched. And then, against every rule written and rehearsed for generations, the two women stepped forward. Not together, not planned, but instinctively like sisters in mourning, not symbols in a monarchy. The guards didn't know whether to move or freeze. The moment hung in the air, suspended, fragile. In less than 10 seconds, history changed. Not because of a speech, not because of a political act, but because two women chose humanity over protocol. And no one, absolutely no one, was ready for it. Let me know if you want a slight tone shift before we move to step 2, setting the scene, or keep this exact voice. Also, want step 2 to be around 300 words as well, or stretch it longer. The morning had begun with stillness. Not silence, London never sleeps, but a sort of reverence in the air. Traffic stopped. Shop shutters lowered. Flags hung at half-mast. Across the kingdom, every television screen in the country, from hospital waiting rooms to school staff rooms, was tuned in. It was the day Britain buried the last monarch of the old world, and the first act of the new reign had already begun. King William's face had barely appeared before headlines began. The young king walks alone, eyes of the world on William. He had only been on the throne for weeks, yet the weight of legacy pressed down like centuries all at once. People wanted to see if he could carry it. Behind him, his wife Catherine walked with quiet discipline. She had trained for this role in silence through years of scrutiny, tabloid venom, public worship, and personal loss. Her steps were steady, her face a mask, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. Not fear, not fragility, just the exhaustion of someone who knows too well what duty costs. Next to her, Princess Anne was a contrast. Hardened by time, built from steel, yet softened by grief. She had buried a father, a mother, and now her role was to support her nephew, the new king, and to protect the family image. Always the image. Every move had been planned, every pause scripted. The royal guards trained for years for moments like this. Their walk, their spacing, their silences, nothing was spontaneous. And it was working. The procession moved like clockwork. From Westminster Abbey to Windsor, the route was lined with hundreds of thousands of mourners. Some waved flags, others simply stood still. No chanting, no cheers, just a collective understanding. This was history. Camera crews from 80 nations stood perched on rooftops and balconies. Drones hovered silently. There was nowhere to hide. If anyone faltered even for a second, the world would see it. But the eyes weren't only on William. They were watching Catherine. She was the heartbeat of the monarchy's future, and for all her grace, she wasn't raised royal. People waited to see if she would bend or break. Beside her, Anne sensed it. The pressure, the choreography, the tightrope. And then, the wind came. Just a breeze, enough to disturb a single white rose. The moment hadn't arrived yet, but its weight was already creeping in. By the time the procession reached the last stretch towards St. George's Chapel, something had shifted in the air. The crowd had grown quieter, not solemn still, like they sensed something no one could name. The heavy rhythm of drums had softened. The footsteps fell harder, and in that brief silence between two ceremonial notes, Catherine felt the world press down. She hadn't cried, not once, not on camera, not even behind closed doors. But her throat burned, her chest tightened, not because of the cameras or the scrutiny, but because of a small piece of paper she'd found that morning in George's handwriting. He had drawn a crown and written, "For Gan, be brave like her, mummy." She had folded it quietly, placed it into her sleeve, and said nothing. Because that's what royal women do. They carry things in silence. Now, walking past the stone steps of the chapel, her eyes caught something small but impossible to ignore. The white rose atop the coffin, the one George had chosen himself, had loosened, tilted in the wind. It wasn't gone, but it was off-center, shifting, vulnerable. She blinked hard, held her breath, and kept walking. And noticed. She always noticed. Decades older, but tuned to Catherine like an older sister forged by fire. She had seen this moment before, years ago when she herself had been told to hold composure as her mother, the Queen, was lowered into the ground. She leaned closer, just enough to speak under her breath. "You don't have to watch it fall." Catherine's jaw clenched. She whispered back without turning, "I promised George I'd keep it in place." They both knew what that meant. They both knew the rules, and they both knew what it would look like to break them. 10 steps later, the breeze returned. Not harsh, just enough to lift the ribbon holding the rose. It fluttered, then sagged. The guards held formation. But inside, that moment, suspended in the thick air between duty and grief, something passed between the two women. A glance, barely a second, but it said everything. They didn't speak again. They didn't gesture, but they both knew what was about to happen. 10 steps from the chapel gate, they broke formation. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no cry, no signal. Just two women veering slightly to the left, stepping out of the tight, symmetrical line of mourners where they absolutely were not meant to be. The guards noticed it instantly. The nearest officer trained to maintain formation, even in chaos, flinched. His hand moved to signal correction, but he hesitated. These weren't junior aides or palace staff. These were the future queen and the king's sister, and they were moving with intention. The broadcast cameras caught the shift, but the commentary froze. The BBC feed, which had been whispering solemn facts for over an hour, went dead silent. No one knew what to say, or whether they were even allowed to say it. Catherine and Anne reached the coffin together. Catherine's fingers trembled as she reached toward the flower. For a second, she hovered. The ribbon had slipped, just enough to expose the stem. The white petals were bruised. She adjusted it not for the cameras, not for the country, but for her son, so that when he watched this moment someday, he'd know the rose stayed in place. Anne, who had been silent all morning, moved beside her. She knelt, just slightly, not in prayer, not in performance, just enough to place her gloved hand on the casket's edge. 10 seconds. That's how long it lasted. But in those 10 seconds, the choreography cracked, protocol broke, and history caught its breath. The guards didn't move. Neither did the king. For the first time in hours, the procession stalled. Two senior royals were standing uncommanded at the center of the most sacred moment of the state funeral, and no one knew what to do. The crowd didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The silence deepened, like a wave pulling back before it crashes. Behind her veil, Catherine blinked once, stood upright, and stepped back. Anne followed. They returned to their places without a word. The line closed. The rhythm resumed. But nothing was the same. Something had shifted, not just in the mood, but in the monarchy. For the first time in decades, a royal act wasn't dictated by tradition. It came from instinct, from emotion, from something entirely human. And everyone watching on the streets, in their homes, behind palace walls felt it. Inside the palace, the silence was short-lived. As soon as Catherine and Anne returned to their place in line, aides behind the scenes were already reacting. Phones buzzed. Security radios clicked to life. A press officer leaned forward in a viewing room and muttered, "Did they just?" The live broadcast didn't cut the feed entirely, but within seconds, producers switched to wide shots, pulling the focus away from the moment. In other countries, the clip stayed in full view. CNN called it a surprising pause in an otherwise exacting ceremony. In France, Le Monde called it un geste de cœur, a gesture from the heart. Inside the palace, however, the reaction was colder. The Lord Chamberlain, tasked with preserving royal order, asked one question: was it approved? The answer: no, it hadn't been discussed in advance. It wasn't rehearsed. And to some inside the institution, that made it dangerous. But no one was rushing to discipline either woman, because the world was already reacting. By the time the ceremony ended and the family reached Windsor, The clip had gone viral. Millions were watching the replay on social media before Catherine had even stepped out of the state car. It wasn't just trending, it was dominating global conversation. Hashtag Catherine and Anne. Hashtag royal pause. Hashtag when they stopped. Hashtag defying protocol. Every variation lit up timelines. The public reaction was overwhelming. Thousands of messages poured in within the hour. That was the realest moment in royal history. Catherine did what every grieving mother would do, and has always led by example. This was no different. Newsrooms rushed out headlines. The Guardian, grief over etiquette, a moment that changed everything. Sky News, when duty stopped and love took its place. Even tabloids, usually harsh, held back their claws. But within the palace, it was complicated. William remained composed throughout the burial. Cameras caught him exchanging a glance with Catherine afterward, neutral, unreadable. He said nothing in public, but inside Windsor's private quarters, he reportedly asked only one question: "Did you do it for him? For George?" Catherine nodded. He didn't scold her. He didn't praise her. He just held her hand. Anne, on the other hand, remained quiet. She spoke to no reporters. She issued no statement. She didn't need to. Those 10 seconds had said everything she wanted to say. Behind closed doors, conversations began. What happens next time? Do we ignore it? Do we allow it again? Did they set a precedent? No one had the answers. And that's what made it so powerful. For the first time in a long time, the royals had done something unfiltered, and the world wasn't just watching. It was listening. It spread faster than any official broadcast ever could. Clips of Catherine adjusting the rose and Anne kneeling beside the coffin were on every major platform within minutes. TikTok edits emerged with soft piano tracks. Instagram Reels added slow zooms and black and white filters. Twitter did what Twitter always does: froze the best frame, added captions, and sent it into the algorithm like wildfire. In under 12 hours, the clip had been viewed over 65 million times across all platforms. Not just in the UK, everywhere. Brazil, Germany, South Korea, Kenya, even parts of Russia ran it on state media under the headline, "Royal Blood, Human Heart." But it wasn't just viewers. It was voices, former press secretaries, cultural historians, grief counselors, even royal critics. British commentator Aisha Benson, this wasn't rebellion. It was permission. Permission for the public to feel something again at royal events. That matters. CNN royal analyst James Horwood, people think the monarchy is out of touch. This made them feel reachable, even if just for 10 seconds. The Daily Mail, often harsh on Catherine, ran a rare, respectful front page. A flower, a gesture, a kingdom paused. In France, one headline read, "L'acte silencieux qui brise les règles," the silent act that broke the rules. But perhaps the most striking response came from ordinary people. Thousands of letters began arriving at Kensington Palace and Buckingham alike. Some typed, some handwritten. Most simple: "Thank you for showing grief. I lost my mum last year. That act Catherine fixing the flower undid me. We watched with our children. They cried. We cried." It reminded us that behind the crowns, there are people. Even within the royal family, dynamics shifted. Princess Beatrice reportedly texted Catherine that night, "You made the monarchy feel real again." Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, who had always carried her own quiet dignity, sent no message but sent flowers, white roses. And while the press spun, and politicians debated whether it was a PR masterstroke or a moment of genuine loss, the public had already decided this was authentic. And authenticity, real, visible, undeniable humanity, was rare in royal history. For once, Catherine wasn't being critiqued for her outfit, and wasn't being labeled cold. No comparisons, no gossip, just respect. Viewers across continents wrote about watching the clip in silence, not scrolling, not reacting, just watching. One mother wrote, "My daughter asked, 'Why is she touching the flower?' I said, 'Because sometimes love has to interrupt tradition.'" In a world flooded with spectacle, this moment stood out because it wasn't staged. No statement followed, no spin, no correction. Just two women doing something that needed no explanation. 3 days later, behind the tall windows of Windsor, the silence hadn't faded. There was no official statement, no apology, no explanation. And that silence in itself was the answer. The palace knew better than to smother a fire that had warmed millions. But inside the institution, conversations were happening. The Lord Chamberlain quietly requested a private meeting with senior aides. The topic wasn't scandal, it was protocol. How should these moments be handled in the future? Was emotion now acceptable? Could grace, even if unscripted, be part of the tradition? No firm answers. But one phrase appeared in the internal notes: discretionary emotional exceptions. It was unofficial, of course. No one would admit it existed. But the shift had begun. Catherine, meanwhile, said very little. Those close to her said she seemed lighter, not proud, not smug, just still, as if the act had released something she'd been carrying for years, and returned to her duties the next day. She didn't reference the moment once. Not in her speech to a naval unit, not in her private meetings, but her team noticed she wore a small white rose brooch, one that hadn't been seen before. William stayed quiet publicly, but in a private dinner with his father, King Charles, still in recovery, he reportedly said only one sentence about it. It wasn't planned, but maybe it needed to happen. Charles didn't respond. He simply raised a glass and nodded. In the weeks that followed, viewership of the funeral replay surpassed any other royal broadcast in over a decade. Not because of the ceremony, not because of the king, but because of 10 seconds that broke the pattern. Journalists started calling it the pause. Teachers used it in classrooms to talk about grief and dignity. Clergy referenced it in sermons. Therapists noted an increase in patients bringing it up in session, not as spectacle, but as something quietly healing. And perhaps that was the point. In a monarchy known for distance, for restraint, for polished surfaces and choreographed expressions, two women let their guard slip, and in doing so, they connected an ancient institution to a very modern need to feel seen. That act didn't weaken the monarchy. It made it human. And that, more than any speech or headline, will be what history remembers. In the end, it wasn't the crown, or the uniforms, or the grandeur that stayed with people. It was a rose, gently lifted back into place. A hand, resting quietly on wood. A moment where two women stepped outside the frame of duty and into something real. That's what people replayed. That's what they talked about. Not the procession, not the speeches, just that pause. That 10 seconds where the world stopped pretending. Catherine didn't need approval, and didn't need permission. They just acted. And maybe that's what made it unforgettable. Because grief doesn't care about protocol, and love doesn't wait for clearance. What they did wasn't grand. It was small, simple, but it reminded millions that beneath the titles and the traditions, they are daughters, mothers, sisters, just like the rest of us. So if that moment meant something to you, if you felt something watching it, don't let it fade. Talk about it. Share it. Let others feel it too. And if you believe dignity doesn't require distance, then you're already part of what's changing. If this story moved you, subscribe. If you want more truth beneath the headlines, hit the bell. And if you saw yourself in their silence, leave a comment. We're listening.